What's up, guys? So in this video, I'm going to do a little bit more of a deep dive on the 12 cities that the secret treasures are buried in, just because I want to share just a few more things with you that I didn't get a chance to talk about previously. So in the first city, which is Roanoke, also known as the Lost Colony, the flagship actually landed on Croatoan Island. And Croatoan Island is historically identified as modern-day Hatteras Island. So if we were to look at a map, this is Roanoke Island. Hatteras Island is down here. So this was the original landing location of the Lost Colony. Then in August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a child, Christian Virginia Dare. And if we went to the first historical colonies marker, the sign for this actually talks about the birthplace of Virginia Dare, first child born of English parents in America. But in reality, Virginia Dare was most likely born on Hatteras Island because that was August 18th. Then on August 27th, the colonists decided to move 50 miles up Albemarle Sound, which is where Roanoke Island is. So they eventually made their way 50 miles north to the island of Roanoke. From there, they were actually left alone for 3 years. There were supposed to be several ships coming through to bring supplies and check on them, but due to several unforeseen circumstances, that never happened. So the colonists were not checked up on for 3 years. And when they finally got back to the island, all they found was the word Croatoan carved into one of the posts. They thought it meant that maybe they went back to Croatoan Island. But this is probably the most interesting part. They had agreed in 1587 that the colonists would leave a secret token indicating their destination, or a cross-patay. Cross-patay is also known as a Templar cross, as a duress code. And this never happened. And they were never heard from again. I talked a little bit about in the San Antonio tribute puzzle. On the left side here, you could see that there is such a thing as a Freemason sign of distress. And according to legend, Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna is believed to have used a Masonic sign of distress to save his life after being captured by Texans at the Battle of San Jacinto. So interesting to note that the Freemasons have a sign of distress, and in the Roanoke puzzle, they talk about using a duress code. And now we'll move on. Next is the Milwaukee picture, the city of Milwaukee. The city of Milwaukee was probably first explored by a man named Robert LaSalle. Robert LaSalle was a Frenchman who came over to Montreal. He was a Jesuit. LaSalle explored many areas, including the Great Lakes, parts of Canada, the Mississippi River, and he's best known for an expedition from the Mississippi River on the Illinois River to the Gulf of Mexico. And he also gave the name La Louisiane in honor of St. Louis to the state of Louisiana. But as far as the city of Milwaukee is concerned, there are three founding fathers, one being Solomon Juneau, another Byron Kilbourne, and another George H. Walker. And it's interesting to note that Byron Kilbourne and George H. Walker were Freemasons. They actually helped form the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of Wisconsin. Solomon Juneau, however, was not associated with the Freemasons, but one interesting fact about him is the property that is believed to have once been the site of his house is now the site of the Mitchell Building. And the Mitchell Building is right here next to the Milwaukee River. And this is what it looks like. But we heard in the Milwaukee Verses the three stories of Mitchell, and that is in regards to this man, Alexander Mitchell, who was a Scottish immigrant. So interesting to note that Alexander Mitchell actually built a building where Solomon Juneau's house once stood. So interesting to note that. Next, we have the Cleveland picture and the history of Cleveland. Cleveland was founded by General Moses Cleveland of the Connecticut Land Company. And the city of Cleveland was actually started right on the east bank of the Cuyahoga River. Also, Moses Cleveland was a Freemason, and he was a prominent Mason who served as the Grand Marshal of the Grand Lodge of Connecticut before he started the city of Cleveland. Also, I mentioned previously that there was a statue of Dante close to where the Greek Cultural Garden was, and that's actually in the Italian Cultural Garden. And here you can see the statue of Dante Alighieri in the Italian Garden. It doesn't really play a significance, but it's there for you to see. Next, we have the Charleston picture and the city of Charleston. And the city of Charleston was actually named after King Charles II of England. It was first known as Charlestown, not Charleston. And according to records, Charles II was a Freemason as well. And the initial location for the city of Charleston was not where it is now, but rather in the Old Town, the Landing State Historical Site. And this is where the original city of Charleston started. It eventually moved across to the more island area later in time. Also, I wanted to point out that the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rites of Freemasonry was founded in Charleston, South Carolina in May of 1801 at Shepherd's Tavern, but it is no longer there. They actually split. One is in Massachusetts and the other one is in Washington, D.C., and then they also have a third in New Orleans, Louisiana. But I'm sure you can understand that when I say that the lion probably represents the Scottish Rites Freemasonry, if this was the birthplace of the Scottish Rites Freemasonry, obviously they would want to have some kind of a symbol for that. So that's why the lion is for Scottish Rites Freemasonry, which was founded in Charleston, South Carolina. Also, one thing of note, Charleston, South Carolina is located pretty close to the 33rd parallel. Due to its proximity, it's technically just south of that line, but it is on the close to the 33rd degree parallel. And in Freemasonry, the highest degree you can attain is the 33rd degree. So interesting to note there as well. Next, we have the Chicago picture and the city of Chicago. Now, the first known reference to the site of the current city of Chicago as Chicago was by Robert de La Salle, where we spoke about previously in the city of Milwaukee. But he was not the first person to live here and settle. The first non-native settler in Chicago was a man named Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, a Frenchman of European and African descent. And here you can see a drawing of what he might have looked like. Jean-Baptiste means John the Baptist, and where he settled was in Pioneer Court, and Pioneer Court is just north along the Chicago River. We have DuSable Bridge, Jean-Baptiste Point DuSable statue, and Pioneer Court is right here. So just wanted to point that out. We'll move on. Next, we have the San Francisco picture and the city of San Francisco. Now, the first people to settle in San Francisco were led by a group of soldiers, and the leader of that group was a man named Juan Bautista de Anza. Juan Bautista also means John the Baptist, so interesting to note there as well. But all he did was build a Mission San Francisco de Asasi, which is now known as Mission Dolores, and he also helped build a military fort in the Presidio. But the first people to actually settle that were non-soldiers was a man, an Englishman named William Richardson, and he built his homestead around what today is Portsmouth Square, and this is basically in Chinatown. So if you were to look at a map at San Francisco, here's Golden Gate Park. Portsmouth Garage is right here, and this is where the first homestead was. Next, we have the Houston picture and the city of Houston. Now, the city of Houston was originally begun by two real estate promoters named John Kirby Allen and Augustus Chapman Allen, and they decided to name their city after a man that was very well known, Sam Houston. And Sam Houston was a prominent Freemason. He was initiated in 1817 in Nashville, Tennessee, and he was later affiliated with the Holland Lodge in Houston, Texas, and he also helped establish the Grand Lodge of Texas later on down the line. So big time Freemason. He was a war veteran and a very prominent figure. And as far as where the city of Houston started, Started right about here at Allen's Landing, right at the confluence of the Buffalo Bayou and the White Oak Bayou. So this is where the city started. Next, we have the Boston picture and the city of Boston. It's pretty interesting to note that the city of Boston was basically an island when people started moving to it, and you could see that Boston was essentially an island when it was founded back in the 1630s. It just had a narrow neck, which would sometimes get flooded during the tide. And originally, the first settler in Boston was a man named William Blackston, and Blackston was the only person to live in what is now Beacon Hill, and he was basically entirely alone for more than 5 years on his own little island. But he eventually invited a man named Isaac Johnson, who was a reverend across the way in Charlestown. And you could see this is where the island of Boston was, and Charleston was across the way. Charlestown, named after King Charles I, and King Charles I was a Freemason himself. And upon William Blackston inviting Isaac Johnson and all of the settlers who were living in Charleston to move to Boston, he agreed to pay for the entire relocation, which they did. However, Isaac Johnson wanted to rename the city, which was known as Shawmut, and he wanted to rename it after the city he used to live in Lincolnshire, England, which was named Boston, which was basically St. Baltus town. They just put it together and it became Boston. Now, a couple of interesting things to note is that Freemasonry began in Boston with the first authorized lodge in the New World, which is basically America, which was chartered back in 1733 by Henry Price at the Bunch of Grapes Taverns. So this is where Freemasonry started in America, and it had some famous members like Paul Revere and Joseph Warren, who were Grand Masters as well. Next, we have the St. Augustine picture and the city of St. Augustine. St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied settlement of European origin in the continental United States and was founded in 1565 by Spanish Admiral Pedro Menendez de Aviles. This person right here was a knight of the Order of Santiago, and the Order of Santiago was basically a 12th century Spanish religious and military order founded around 1160 to 1170 to protect pilgrims on the way of St. James and flight in the Reconquista. So they were a military order very similar to that of the Knights Templar, founded in roughly the same time. And it's also interesting to note that they followed the rule of St. Augustine rather than the stricter Cistercian rules, so it's not a very big surprise that a knight of the Order of Santiago that follows the rule of St. Augustine would name the city after St. Augustine. And we've talked a little bit about St. Augustine before, the actual person, and that is Augustine of Hippo. Now, as far as Freemasonry in St. Augustine, it dates back to at least 1750s. And it's also interesting to note that the city's Monumento de la Constitution also features symbols that may be Masonic in origin. And if we were to click on what that looks like, well, what do you know? We have an obelisk, and we've seen obelisks before, so I'm sure we'll see them again. Next, we have the Montreal picture and the city of Montreal. Jacques Cartier was the first person known to reach the area that is known as Montreal today. He did not set up any kind of a settlement, though. Later, Samuel de Champlain also visited Montreal, and he unsuccessfully created a fur trading post that was eventually eliminated. Now, it wasn't until 1642 that a man named Jérôme Le Royer de la Dauversière, with the help of the Roman Catholic Church, started an organization called the Société Notre Dame de Montréal. And he did this in conjunction with a few people. And that was also Jean-Jacques Ollier and Pierre Chevrier. And they were also joined by a few other people later. But a little bit of background with Jérôme Le Royer. is he was one of the first pupils of the Jesuit college at La Fleche, and he had several contemporaries such as Rene Descartes, who was a very famous philosopher, and I think we touched on him previously. Also, his co-founder Jean-Jacques Ollier was somebody who had a Jesuit background as well. He was given a thorough education in the classics at the local Jesuit college, and he later founded the Order of Saint Sulpice. But interesting to note that two of the main people who started the Society de Notre Dame had Jesuit backgrounds. Also, Jerome de la Royere also started something called the Religious Hospitallers of Saint Joseph. So this isn't quite the Knights of Hospitallers, but they had similar purposes, which was to help the poor and the sick. So very interesting to note that. And a little bit more of a deeper dive on Jerome Le Royer. He was from a province called Anjou, France. And Anjou, France had a deep association with the Knights Templar. The King of Jerusalem was a man named Fulk V, Count of Anjou, and he was an associate member of the Knights Templar in 1120. He donated heavily to the Knights Templar, and after he became King of Jerusalem, the Anjou dynasty continued to support the Templars, with Robert of Craon, a close affiliate, becoming Grand Master later on. They have a legacy of the Angevin dynasty being intertwined with the Templars, and later Rene d'Anjou continued to have dealings with the knightly orders in the 15th century. So the area where Jerome de Royer was from was very much involved with the Templars. Now, the Société de Notre Dame of Montreal was not a Jesuit order, but they did operate alongside Jesuits. And it's also interesting to note that the Jesuits had a very similar structure to that of the Knights Templar. They shared similarities in their roles as elites, centralized Catholic orders, and both amassed significant influence, leading to their respective suppression. Both orders operated with a highly centralized military-like hierarchy. The Templars were governed by a Grand Master, while the Jesuits were led by a superior general, often referred to as the Black Pope. Both organizations were considered intellectual or elite in their respective eras, wielding considerable wealth and power that caused fear or jealousy among secular monarchs. Both orders required strict adherence to vows, including obedience to superiors and the Pope. The Templars were literal warrior monks, while the Jesuits were founded with a militaristic spirit. They were originally called the Militia of Jesus, kind of interesting, but they focused more on the spiritual warfare, education, and missionary work. And as I said before, both were suppressed after they gained too much power. The Templars in 1312, which we talked about, and the Jesuits in 1773. So although these two organizations were in different time frames, they had a lot of similarities. And it's also interesting to note that Notre Dame, we've seen that before. Notre Dame, the island of Notre Dame, the Basilica of Notre Dame. The city was originally founded right here in the center of Ville Marie, and this means the village of Marie. And the mountain, or Montreal, actually means the Royal Mountain. So interesting to note all those things: Mount Royal, the Royal Mountain, the Village of Mary, Notre Dame Cathedral, which is continually referenced throughout the city. Next, we have the New York picture and the history of New York City. We talked earlier about Giovanni de Verrazzano being the first person to kind of explore the area. But it wasn't really until the early 1600s that the Dutch came and they settled the lower part of Manhattan. It was originally known as New Amsterdam. And one of the first directors of New Amsterdam was a man named Peter Minuet, who was a Walloon merchant and politician, and the third director of the Dutch North American colony of New Netherlands. The book actually talks about Peter Minuet specifically on page 30, so if you want to make reference to that. Also, the Walloon Settlement Monument that I talked about earlier, this is in direct reference to that. But it wasn't until between 1664 and 1783 that the English took over, and it was part of an effort by King Charles II's brother, James, the Duke of York, to acquire New Netherlands, which they did. And soon after, New Netherlands, New Amsterdam was renamed New York after the Duke, and James, Duke of York, was eventually going to become James II and the seventh King of England and Ireland. And James II was a Freemason as well. So the city of New York, named after James II, Duke of York, who was a Freemason. And again, when we look at New York, a couple of things that we pointed out earlier, Giovanni di Verrazzano statue monument and the Walloons Settler monument after Peter Minuet. Next, we have the New Orleans picture and the city of New Orleans. New Orleans was founded in early 1718 by the French, by Louisiana Governor Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville. Jean-Baptiste, once again, John the Baptist, and they named it after the then regent of France, Philip II, Duke of Orleans. And something very interesting about Philip II, Duke of Orleans, was that aside from being the regent of France, he was elected as the 41st Grand Master of a revived secret order of the Templars in March of 1705. This was not the original medieval order destroyed in the 14th century, but an 18th century organization claiming to continue the Templar tradition. And according to the website, the Knights Templar 1119.org, it says that the order continued in secret with an uninterrupted line of Grand Masters until 1705, and in that year a number of French nobles held a convention of Templars at Versailles. They elected Philip, Duke of Orleans, and later regent of France, and as such he provided an official renewal and legitimization of the Order of the Temple as a secular order of chivalry with its rights to resume the use of the word sovereign in its title. And the original location was in the French Quarter. That's where New Orleans started. And also, one additional thing of note is right by Jackson Square. If you guys have ever been here, very close to the Café du Monde, we have the St. Louis Cathedral. And St. Louis is somebody we might have touched on a little earlier, but interesting to note that St. Louis, who had been a part of several of the Crusades, would have a church named after him in New Orleans. Also, a couple of other things I wanted to mention real quickly was that there is a Grand Commandery of Knights Templar of Louisiana located in New Orleans. Also, in 1922, there was a conclave called the 35th Triennial Conclave, which brought together 30,000 Masonic Knights Templar to the city, featuring a 55-foot, 35-ton papier-mâché arch of a mounted knight on Canal Street. And I found this picture on Instagram, which shows them in 1922. Also, I mentioned earlier that they had a Supreme Council of the Scottish Rites Freemasonry branch in Louisiana, and that location is at 3200 St. Bernard Avenue. Now, for some reason, when you click on that address, it comes up as a restaurant. I don't know what kind of food they would have, but Ordo ab Chao, or Chao, that's their motto, order out of chaos. But if you were to zoom in on it, you would see it's basically a Freemason guild here. So just wanted to mention those things. So just to wrap things up, I wanted to break down the cities that were in the book into separate categories. The first were cities named after John the Baptist, who were founded by them. You have San Francisco, Chicago, and New Orleans. San Francisco was Juan Batista, and Chicago and New Orleans were men named Jean Baptiste. Next, we have cities that were founded or named after Freemasons. The first three, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Houston, were named after or founded by American Freemasons. Charleston, Boston, New York were named after monarchs from England. I categorize Boston and Charlestown as one city just because the residents of Charlestown came over to Boston, and that's what the city of Boston was first comprised of when it was founded. And then also you have cities that were founded or associated with religious orders. St. Augustine with the Order of Santiago, which was based on the principles of Augustine of Hippo. Montreal was the Société de Notre Dame de Montréal, some Jesuit ties there. Roanoke, this was a little more difficult to place, but because of the cross-patay that they were supposed to use as a sign of distress, I decided to list that under religious orders, namely the Knights Templar. The Freemasons do have something similar, a sign of distress that they use when they are in trouble, so I decided to list that under them because Roanoke is not named after anybody in particular. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll talk to you guys next time.